China and the U.S. heading towards a Cold War?
The term Cold War, as far as I know, has no set definition, except that it feels like a war and there's no shooting and there's a sense of hostility. So the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union had tension, had alliances, had a fundamental ideological dispute, and of course had spying. The new one between the U.S. and the autocracies led by China has many of the same characteristics. So I guess I'll have to go with perhaps a chilly war.
We see with the balloon incident and with these police, this is not espionage. This is a bit of a game of public relations espionage. It's sort of like TV espionage. The real espionage is not what we're seeing, but is really taking place both in China and both the United States. It's a game that's understood that's going on. When the balloon is flying over the United States, it's not a sophisticated way of seeing what's going on. And when some people are hassling activists here in the United States, it's not right, it's not good, but it's far from being serious espionage.
It's a version of it. I mean, I was going to say, I doubt there is a single viewer, including in China, if we have viewers in China, that necessarily believes the Chinese government's denials. But I would agree that the spying thing is overall a little bit of a comical issue. The lady doth protest too much. Everyone pretends to be shocked about the very thing that they both know about and clearly carry out themselves. Of course, China and the U.S. are spying on each other, whether in cyberspace or on the ground. In China's case, balloons. We also know democracies spy on their own citizens within their own borders. It's no big stretch to envision the Chinese spying on Chinese and harassing Chinese in other countries in the U.S. and Europe. If there's any real anger about this, I would say it's about the use of U.S. citizens who are Chinese background. Note that they were not charged with spying, but rather with acting as agents for a foreign government. And I would say that the ones with the most reason to be angry are Chinese Americans, in the same way that many Jews were unhappy that Israel used Jonathan Pollard in the 80s.
Taiwan's drive towards independence it's not denied. It cannot be denied that Washington plays a very key role here. Even though the United States doesn't even recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state, it goes out of its way to threaten countries that are about to establish diplomatic relationships with China. So, certainly there's an element of encouraging and supporting Taiwan independence on the part of Washington.
Well, look, the People's Republic of China never controlled Taiwan. And, Taiwan, under Formosa, went back and forth between different powers. I think the U.S. position, awkward as it undoubtedly is a sort of compromise between trying to allow democratic government to function unimpeded in a very tiny area of what can overall be considered China. Tiny, minuscule, and not offend China too much. And I have to say, what I've called the astounding gluttony of giants always amazes me. How on earth can China, a country that is the second largest landmass in the world, tied for it, really care that much about a little island? I have to think that beyond simple geographical hubris may lie the fact that Taiwan's being a vibrant and successful democracy somewhat puts paid to the notion that there's something in Chinese culture that is fundamentally, in antipathy towards liberal democracy.
Well, Dan, I'm quite positive that Jerusalem is even smaller than Taiwan. And look. Martin.
That's a good analogy.
Yes. By the way, the gluttony of the Arab world that can't tolerate little Israel existing there, at least for years couldn't, is of a piece with that. As is Russia, the world's largest landmass, far bigger than China, insisting on expanding itself a little bit, despite the horrific cost that this entails. It really is amazing. I actually think the U.S. has more of a China problem than China has a U.S. problem, in the sense that the U.S. is strangely more ideological. I think the U.S., elements in the U.S., actually are ideological about the fomenting of democracy elsewhere. They might have learned a few lessons in Iraq, but that is still a very strong aspect of America's worldview, whereas China, I think, is weirdly less ideological in the sense that their various initiatives to win hearts and minds in Africa and Pakistan and elsewhere are largely about trade, and they're not trying to turn anyone into a fellow communist dictatorship. By the way, in the way that the Soviet Union did The Soviet Union actually tried to make everyone socialistic who was their ally. China doesn't really do that, and America is ideological and missionary about its democracy.
Is she winning the battle over Europe? Dan Perry, your thoughts?
Europe is clearly not going to adopt Chinese ways, but there's every sign that it's more inclined than the U.S. to adapt. We see this in the Scholz and Macron visits and various statements, and it relates to a post-World War II antipathy to conflict and ideological pliancy, and also to trade. Remember, China is the largest importer from the European Union, about $250 billion worth last year, double that of the U.S. So I think a lot of Europeans want to be practical, and they might ask, have the European people not suffered enough from the Russian energy fiasco?
So what is next? Let me put it simply. Dan Perry.
I think what is next is, as we began in saying, a chilly war between these two powers, constant tit for tat, and a lot of nervousness in the months to come about China's moves regarding Taiwan.
As a matter of fact, I would characterize what's happening recently in the Middle East as the great rapprochement, the greatest rapprochement. I mean, you're talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran making good with each other. We're talking about diplomatic relations between Bahrain and UAE and Qatar, for example, and a whole list of Turkey with Egypt and even Syria going back to the Arab world. I mean, all these developments, I don't see anything wrong, anything detrimental to the peace and prosperity of the region. Everything is good.
Peace and prosperity, not an accidental term there, Professor Zhang.
Exactly.
No, I have to say, though, I mean, bringing Iran back into the fold without exacting from Iran any price as regards its nuclear program or its general behavior in the region is not necessarily something that one could characterize as the promotion of peace, but rather perhaps the promotion of cynical power realignments.
Gentlemen, Martin Himmel, Professor Gong Xiong, Dan Perry, thank you so very much. Pleasure to have you on Global Eye every single time.